Hey guys, this first lesson is titled, Is Science Trustworthy? These days, you get a lot of information on the coronavirus. Should people wear masks? Should we be returning to school? How fatal is it? There's a lot of different questions and oftentimes a lot of different information. And so today, we're going to really start by taking a look at what science is and is it trustworthy? So let's take a look. The first thing we're going to look at are dependent, independent, and control variables. These are the first key points. The first one, dependent variable, that's what is measured. First, let me just say all scientific experiments, or most scientific experiments, will have some combination of these things. Not all of them follow this kind of format, and not all scientific experiments always have these three things, but usually, a lot of times, you'll see this. So the dependent variable is what is being measured. An independent variable is what is changed. And a control variable is what is consistent across experiments. And we use these to determine whether or not something has an effect. For example, let's take a look at this classic experiment with 3 plants. Here we have one that had sun and water. The second condition was that it just had sun, and the third one just had water. Well, in this case, the dependent variable, what is measured, is plant growth. We can measure the height of these plants, how tall they grow, even how much they weigh. Those are things that we measure, and those are the dependent variables. The independent variable is what is changed across these conditions. And to really tease this out, we're going to take a look at 2 specifically. So let me turn on my pen here. Let's say we were taking a look at these 2, the one with sun and water versus the one with just sun. Well, what's being changed, the independent variable, is how much water the plant receives. So in this case, there's water. In the case on the right, there's no water. That's what we're changing, and that's the independent variable. What is the control variable? Well, this is what is consistent. In this case, both of these have sun. So the control variable between these first 2 cases is the sun. It's kept consistent across the experiment. Let's take a look at another example. Let's say we look at this plant right here, sun and water versus just water. What do you think the independent variable is? What's being changed? Well, it's not water, because they both have water. What is being changed is the amount of sun. This has sun, this has no sun. And the control variable is water, because they both get water. The reason why scientists do experiments like this is to figure out, for example, in this case, what is the effect of the sun on the plant? In the first case, the first example we looked at, the question would have been, what is the effect of water on plants? Everything else is kept consistent. For example, here we're keeping the sun consistent. In the second case, we're keeping water consistent. There are other things that are being consistent that are considered control variables as well. They're probably using the same pots. They're probably using the same plants. They might be using the same soil. Basically, everything else needs to be kept consistent. Otherwise, one of those things that weren't kept consistent could be affecting your results. For example, let's say you used a different type of soil. Well, that may have contributed to your results and not either the sun or water, which is what you're looking at. Like I said, not all science is performed this way, but a lot of it is. And so we're going to look at some experiments later on where they looked at specific things to answer questions, and they usually involve some combination of these variables to answer those questions reliably. Before we do that, though, I want to make a point about the difference between primary and secondary sources. When we see information, for example, on the coronavirus, some of them can be considered to be coming from primary sources. Others are secondary sources. What are the difference? Well, primary sources are those where actual experiments were performed and data was collected and reported. That means we're hearing results from people who conducted the actual experiments. That's a primary source. They had direct access to the data. A secondary source is something you might find on a news article or a government agency that's relaying information. These people didn't do the actual experiments. They're just relaying the information, and that's what makes them a secondary source. It doesn't necessarily mean they're not trustworthy, but it's important to be able to know the difference so you can identify what is a good source of information and what's not a good source of information. Let's take a look at some. This first one is from a scientific journal called Nature Medicine. And this is a journal that basically scientists usually working at universities will conduct studies and submit an article that the scientists write to this journal for publication. Now, how would we know that? Even if you didn't know what Nature Medicine is, if you can just take a look at the website, you're going to be able to sense some things about it that differentiate it from a traditional news website. They list the authors, and there's several authors on this. You can tell by the title, Respiratory Virus, Shedding in Exhaled Breath and Efficacy of Face Masks. This is not an ordinary news title. So you can get a sense that it's not just ordinary news. Other features about the website may be able to give you a sense of whether or not it's a good source. Let's read a little bit of this article to see if it's a primary or secondary source. Abstract. That's a shortened version of the article. We identified seasonal human coronaviruses, influenza viruses, and rhinoviruses in exhaled breath and coughs of children and adults with acute respiratory illness. Surgical face masks significantly reduced detection of influenza virus RNA in respiratory droplets and coronavirus RNA in aerosols, with a trend toward reduced detection of coronavirus RNA in respiratory droplets. Our results indicate that surgical face masks could prevent transmission of human coronaviruses and influenza viruses from symptomatic individuals. Let me just make a couple of points here. Number one, seasonal human coronaviruses, the common cold is a type of coronavirus. They're not necessarily referring to COVID-19, although depending on when this was done, it could have included COVID-19. It was published in April of 2020. They probably were working on this research for quite some time, even starting before coronavirus. Surgical face masks significantly reduce the detection of influenza virus RNA. RNA is a type of cellular material. It's a lot like DNA, and they are particles that viruses will produce in order to reproduce themselves, and it helps us detect the presence of the viruses. Now, let's take a look at how you can tell whether or not this is a primary or secondary source. The key question is, did they conduct this research themselves? And if you were to look at the article, and if you were to go down, let's just take a look at one of these tables. If you were to read through this, you would be able to see that they screened 3,363 individuals. So they took these individuals, and these were the participants. And they did a certain technique in order to confirm the presence of the virus. The independent variable was whether or not they were wearing a face mask. So they randomized these groups of participants. And so they didn't necessarily control for many variables across the two groups. One way to avoid having to control for a lot of things, like whether or not people are the same age or whether or not they live in the same area, is you take a random sample. So randomization it's almost a form of control to be able to make sure your groups are equal. And the independent variable was whether or not they wore a face mask. They collected data to see how much virus was present in their exhaled breath, and their results were that people who wore masks exhaled significantly reduced amounts of virus, what they refer to as shedded virus, and this is a primary source because they conducted the research. Let's take a look at another one. This is from the Archives of Disease in Childhood. Now, this is a little bit more complicated. I'm going to go quickly through this because you're going to take a quiz on this, and this won't be in the quiz, but this is an important point. Take a look. Looks like a scientific article. The title is "Children Are Not COVID-19 Super Spreaders. Time to Go Back to School." Uh-oh, is it time for you to go back to school? Let's take a look. In this article, I'm going to read the first paragraph. Since the first reports of SARS-CoV-2 infections in China, doctors, parents, and policymakers have been aware that COVID-19 is not just another respiratory virus in children. There is a large discrepancy in case rate and prognosis between young children and older adults that has caught everyone by surprise, and for which the mechanisms remain unknown. As community testing has demonstrated a significant number of children with no or subclinical symptoms, key questions need answering. Are there low rates of confirmed infection in children because children are not becoming infected and or infectious, or is COVID-19 in children usually such a benign upper respiratory illness that does not even cause infants or immune-suppressed children to need hospital admission? If children are infected, are they infectious to each other or to adults? If so, for how long? So this article is getting at the question about how infectious children are and how liable they are to get it. Now, if you were to read through this article, what you would find is they cite a lot of research. In addition, for example, there's been very little evidence so far in the effects of COVID-19 on children with comorbidities. This contrasts significantly to COVID-19 disease in adults. All three children who required intubation in a large Chinese cohort studied had comorbidities. But if it is not clear if COVID-19 was the reason for their needing intensive care. They go on to cite studies, for example, right here. Evidence is emerging that children could be significantly less likely to become infected than adults. What they do is they cite data from several studies that support this claim. And basically these studies look at, they test large numbers of children, and they take a look at the infection rate within the population, and they're finding that the infection rate within children seems to be lower than the overall population. Do you think this is a primary or secondary source? Did they do the experiments themselves and collect the data themselves? They did not. This is a secondary source, and they are communicating findings from other studies. So even though this is probably seems to be a very trustworthy source, but it is not a primary source. Just to summarize and with a brief comment, what this article is saying is a lot of studies have shown that the infection rate amongst children seems to be lower than the overall general population. Now, before concluding that students don't transmit the disease, you have to take a look at what assumptions people are making, what the setup of these experiments are, what the data is. If students aren't in school for very long times, or they're testing infection rates right at the beginning of the school year, it's likely that transmission among students is going to be lower than the general population. Things like that. You have to take a look at exactly what kind of data is being shown and what conclusions you really can draw from that. But it is showing that amongst children, infection rates seem to be lower. Does that mean that they can't transmit it to adults, even in low amounts? It's not really clear. Let's take a look at a couple of others. This article is about a very highly mentioned drug called remdesivir. And the title of the article is "Remdesivir Shows Promise as Coronavirus Treatment as Nearly All Patients in Trial Released Within a Week." Wow, that sounds really awesome. Well, let's take a look at the source. The source is Newsweek, and they make a magazine. And they also have an online site. So this is basically a news site. Now let's take a look at the actual article so that we can discern whether or not it's trustworthy. It says, early results from a clinical trial of the experimental drug remdesivir reportedly show promising results in the treatment of those suffering from severe COVID-19, with most patients receiving the drug significantly improving within a week. So, first question, is this a primary or secondary source? It is a secondary source. Newsweek did not conduct this research. They're only communicating the results from a study. So this is a secondary source. Now, to see whether or not their conclusions are trustworthy, mind you, this is not a primary source, it's a secondary source, but they're saying that it shows promise as coronavirus treatment. And they're saying nearly all patients in trial released within a week. Does that mean remdesivir works? And does that mean it's going to solve all our coronavirus problems, as this article suggests? Well, let's take a look and read a little bit further. It says the University of Chicago recruited 125 COVID-19 patients for a clinical trial by the drug's manufacturer, Gilead Sciences, including 113 with the severe form of the disease. The video reportedly shows infectious disease specialist Dr. Kathleen Mullane discussing encouraging results from the trial with colleagues at the university earlier in the week. So, before we jump down, number one, we already know that there's not a lot of information given on this study. All it's saying is the number of patients involved and that there was a video from a Dr. Kathleen Mullane discussing the results. It's not even clear whether or not this doctor was part of the study. She's just discussing the results. The next thing it reports is a quote from this doctor that says the best news is that most of the patients have already been discharged, which is great. We've only had 2 patients perish. What does this mean about the efficacy of remdesivir? Well, Was remdesivir the independent variable, and did they have two groups that they performed an independent variable test across? Say one group you getting remdesivir, another group not getting remdesivir? In this type of setup, you would have to control for things like age or prior conditions across two different groups by using a large number of patients and also using a randomized sample. Random to mix up all the different things that could be different across these groups. Oftentimes, this is not possible with medical treatments because we're talking about human lives and you want to do the best to save them and help them no matter what. So, like I said earlier, many studies don't follow such an independent variable type design. It's not always possible. Nonetheless, this isn't that many patients, and the conclusions that you can draw aren't that strong. And really, this article is trying to say that nearly all patients were released within a week because of remdesivir. Well, we cannot come to that conclusion just yet. This is a secondary source, and you have to be really careful about what assumptions they're making. This is a secondary source. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of others. CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, how to protect yourself and others. It talks about knowing how it spreads, washing your hands, avoiding close contact. Is this a primary or secondary source? On this page, if you take a look, where it talks about how it spread and when you should wash your hands, is a secondary source. People have done studies about how viruses spread. People have done studies about how effective it is to wash your hands. People have done studies on social distancing. This is not one of those studies. This is a site by the government that shares information on what to do. It is a secondary source because it is not communicating about the specific studies that came to these conclusions. That's not to say that this information is not trustworthy. In my opinion, this information is trustworthy, but it doesn't mean it's a primary source. Let's take a look at one last one. This is another CDC site that says data. It has the total number of current cases, 4,800,000. The total deaths, 157,000. If we go into about the data, it says, where is this data from? Data on the COVID-19 website and CDC's COVID data tracker are based on the most recent numbers reported by states, territories, and other jurisdictions. It talks a little bit about the accuracy of the data, but already here you can make a judgment about whether or not this data is reliable and whether or not it's a primary or secondary source. So let's think about it. Is this a primary data source or a secondary data source? Well, you could argue that it's a secondary data source because CDC is not doing the actual testing. However, because you need one entity to get all of this data from multiple hospitals and states into one place, I personally would call this a primary data source because their type of experimentation is really just to collect this data and to share it. So you could argue it one way or the other. I would argue it as a primary data source, even though they didn't do the testing themselves. Is it trustworthy? Is it reliable? Well, they say they collect data from states, hospitals, and other jurisdictions. If we assume that these people are testing correctly and their information is accurate and they are accurately and faithfully reporting it and the CDC is communicating it and not changing the data, it is trustworthy. Some people may say, well, this information is not trustworthy and that's not reliable. I would say that that is an extreme conclusion, and we would need extreme, highly compelling evidence to believe that these organizations are fabricating this data in any way. If we don't have that evidence, then it is inappropriate to assume they are fabricating this data, and we can assume that this information is generally reliable and generally accurate. So that's how to identify primary and secondary sources, and we've talked a little bit about what the dependent, independent, and control variables are. Let's go to one example from your practice to just see how you're going to practice this. This is from your homework. This is the first question. Battle of the batteries. Justin is trying to determine which brand of battery he should buy. He buys 2 brands of batteries and decides to conduct an experiment to see which brand lasts longer. He puts battery brand A into his Mega Sounds MP3 player. He puts battery brand B into his friend's Ear Blaster brand MP3 player. He starts both players at the same time and runs them at the same volume. Battery brand B lasts 8 hours longer. Question is the data from this experiment helpful in deciding which brand of battery to purchase? Explain why or why not. Well, let's think about it. He took 2 different types of MP3 players, and he put one brand in the first one and the other brand in the second one. Based on his results, battery brand B lasting 8 hours longer, can we conclude that battery brand B is better? Well, what if the Ear Blaster brand MP3 player used less power than the Mega Sounds? There is no control variable. In this case, there are 2 independent variables. They're changing both the brand of battery and the MP3 player. We cannot conclude that battery brand B is better. We would need to control for the type of MP3 player by using the Mega Sounds MP3 player and using both A and B in that player. And then you could do the same one with the Ear Blaster in order to have a proper control, which is the type of MP3 player. How else can we improve this experiment? Well, we can make sure that they're both playing the same songs, the same playlist, the same kind of jams, and that would be one type of control. Using the same MP3 player across both brands is another type of control. So that's just one example of how we identify and use the independent, dependent, and control variable to determine whether or not their conclusions are sound. Keep practicing it. I'll answer questions in class, and hopefully you're on your way to be able to determine whether or not a certain type of scientific information is good or bad. Good luck.